At first glance, the story seems straightforward. One country built the factory of the world. The other is trying to become the next one. But beneath that simple framing, something more complex is unfolding. A divergence, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady. And over time, it may define the next phase of the global economy. For decades, China followed a path that felt almost inevitable in hindsight. Rapid industrialization, massive infrastructure expansion, a workforce that moved from rural areas into cities, feeding factories that produced goods for the rest of the world. It was scale, applied consistently. Manufacturing capacity expanded year after year, supported by policy, capital, and a demographic structure that allowed it to grow without immediate constraint. The world adjusted around it. Supply chains reorganized, costs fell, production concentrated. China didn't just participate in globalization, it became central to it. At the same time, India was moving along a different trajectory. Growth was real but uneven. Industrialization progressed, but more slowly. Infrastructure developed, but not at the same scale or speed. And instead of becoming a manufacturing powerhouse, India's growth leaned in another direction. Services, technology, outsourcing, digital infrastructure. An economy that expanded not primarily through factories, but through networks. At first, the contrast looked like a gap. China ahead, India catching up. But over time, that gap began to change shape, because the forces that once powered China's rise are no longer moving in the same direction. Population growth has slowed, then stopped. And now, in some regions, it is reversing. A workforce that once expanded year after year is beginning to stabilize, then contract. The demographic momentum that supported decades of industrial growth is fading. At the same time, wages have risen, which on one level reflects success, but on another changes the equation, because higher wages alter the economics of manufacturing. They shift incentives. They push certain types of production outward, toward lower-cost regions, not all at once, but gradually. And as that shift begins, the question emerges: where does that production go? For many, the answer seems obvious. India, a country with a large and growing population, a younger workforce, lower labor costs, and increasing integration into global markets. It appears, at least on the surface, to be the natural successor. But transitions of this scale are rarely simple, because manufacturing is not just about labor. It's about systems, infrastructure, logistics, policy alignment, supply chain depth, reliability at scale. China didn't become a manufacturing hub overnight. It built layers, ports connected to rail connected to industrial zones connected to global shipping networks. Entire ecosystems formed around production, suppliers, subcontractors, specialized services, all operating in coordination. And those ecosystems create inertia. They make relocation possible, but not immediate. India, meanwhile, is building its own version of that system, but from a different starting point. Infrastructure is expanding, but unevenly. Logistics networks are improving, but still developing. Regulatory environments vary across regions. Complexity exists not just in the economy, but in governance itself. Progress is real, but so are the frictions, and that creates a different kind of dynamic. Instead of a clean transfer of manufacturing dominance, what emerges is a more fragmented shift. Some production moves, some stays, some spreads across multiple countries. Supply chains diversify not just toward India, but toward Southeast Asia, Mexico, and other emerging hubs. The system becomes less concentrated, more distributed, more complex. And within that complexity, India and China begin to occupy different roles. China, with its established infrastructure and deep industrial base, remains central to high-scale, high-efficiency manufacturing. India, with its growing workforce and expanding digital economy, builds strength in services, technology, and selective industrial sectors. Two different models, evolving at the same time, competing in some areas, complementing in others, and shaped by forces that extend beyond economics alone. Demographics, policy, geopolitics, global trade patterns, each pushing in different directions, each reinforcing the divergence, because this is not just a race to become the largest economy. It is a question of structure, of how growth is generated, of how systems are built, of what kind of economic future each country is moving toward. And over the next 30 years, those futures may not converge. They may move further apart. Economies are often explained through policy, capital, and technology. But beneath all of that, there is something quieter, something slower, something that does not respond to incentives in the same way. Demographics. It does not move quickly. It cannot be adjusted in a single cycle. It unfolds over decades, shaping everything else without drawing attention to itself. And, in the case of China and India, it is perhaps the most important difference of all. For years, China benefited from what economists sometimes describe as a demographic tailwind, a large, growing workforce, a steady flow of people moving from rural areas into cities, a structure where the number of workers expanded relative to the number of dependents. It created momentum. Factories had access to labor. Costs remained competitive. Output increased. Growth, once established, reinforced itself. But demographic trends do not continue indefinitely. Over time, birth rates declined. Population growth slowed, and eventually the balance began to shift. The workforce stopped expanding. Then, in some cases, it began to contract. At first, the change was subtle, a slowing of growth rather than a reversal. But over time, the direction becomes clearer. Fewer young workers entering the system, more older individuals exiting it. The ratio changes, and that ratio matters, because economies rely not just on population size, but on population structure. How many people are working? How many are dependent? How resources are distributed between them? As that balance shifts, the effects spread. Labor becomes less abundant. Wages rise not just as a sign of progress, but as a response to scarcity. Growth, which once benefited from expansion, must now rely more heavily on productivity. And productivity is harder to scale. It requires innovation, efficiency, and structural change, not just more people. In parallel, the demands on the system increase. Healthcare systems expand. Pension systems become more strained. Public spending adjusts to support an aging population. The economy continues to grow. But it does so under different conditions, with different constraints. India, meanwhile, sits at a different point on that timeline. Its population is still growing. Its workforce is still expanding. Each year, millions of young people enter the labor market. The potential is significant. A large youthful population can support growth in multiple ways. It can supply labor. It can drive consumption. It can create momentum similar to what China experienced in earlier decades. But potential is not the same as outcome, because a growing workforce requires something else. Absorption. Jobs must exist. Opportunities must be created at scale. Infrastructure must support movement, productivity, and expansion. Without that, the demographic advantage does not translate into economic strength. It becomes something else. Pressure. India's challenge, then, is not a lack of people. It is the integration of people into a functioning economic system. Creating enough employment, building enough capacity, ensuring that growth keeps pace with the population entering the workforce. And that is not a simple task. It requires coordination across sectors: manufacturing, services, infrastructure, education. All moving at once, all scaling together. China, on the other hand, faces the inverse challenge. not how to absorb a growing workforce, but how to maintain growth as the workforce stabilizes or declines. Different starting points, different constraints, different paths forward. And these paths extend beyond economics. They shape consumption patterns, savings behavior, investment priorities. Younger populations tend to spend differently. They form households. They drive demand for housing, goods, and services. Older populations shift toward stability, toward healthcare, toward preservation of wealth. The entire structure of the economy evolves with the population, slowly, but decisively. And because demographics move slowly, they are often underestimated. They don't create immediate shocks, they create long-term direction, a kind of underlying current that everything else must follow. Policy can respond to it. Technology can adapt to it. But neither can fully reverse it. And that is what makes the divergence between India and China so significant. It is not just about growth rates, or output, or even global influence. It is about trajectory. One economy moving into a phase where expansion becomes more difficult. Another moving into a phase where expansion is possible, but not guaranteed. And over the next 30 years, those trajectories may matter more than any single policy decision, because they shape the foundation on which everything else is built. Not all growth is built the same way. Some economies expand through physical systems, others expand through networks. And in the case of China and India, those differences define not just how they grow, but how far that growth can extend. China's model is grounded in production. Factories, supply chains, industrial zones, a system where inputs move through coordinated processes and emerge as finished goods, ready to be shipped across the world. It is tangible, visible, heavy with infrastructure, and over time it has been refined to a level of efficiency that is difficult to replicate. Manufacturing at scale is not just about building factories. It is about building ecosystems. A single product often depends on dozens, sometimes hundreds, of suppliers, components sourced from nearby clusters, logistics networks designed for speed and reliability, skilled labor that understands not just how to assemble, but how to adapt, refine, and improve. These systems compound. They become more efficient as they grow, more reliable, more deeply embedded in global trade. And once they reach a certain scale, they create a kind of gravitational pull. Production tends to remain where it is already concentrated, because moving it means rebuilding not just one factory, but an entire network. India's model is built differently, less centered on physical output, more centered on services, software development, business process outsourcing, financial services, digital platforms, growth that moves through information rather than materials, expansion that does not require the same level of physical infrastructure. And because of that, it scales differently. A service can expand without building a new factory. A digital platform can reach global markets without shipping goods across oceans. In theory, this creates flexibility, speed, the ability to grow without the same constraints that define manufacturing. But that flexibility comes with its own limitations. Services tend to concentrate. They require education, training, connectivity. They often cluster in specific urban areas where talent and infrastructure align. And while high-skill sectors can grow rapidly, they do not always absorb labor at the same scale. A factory can employ thousands across a range of skill levels. A technology firm may employ far fewer, even as it generates significant economic value. So the question becomes less about which model grows faster, and more about which model integrates more people. China's manufacturing base has historically absorbed large portions of its workforce. It provided a pathway from rural to urban employment, from lower productivity to higher productivity work. It created not just output, but transition. India's service-led growth creates value, but the pathway is narrower, more dependent on education, more concentrated in certain sectors, and that creates a different kind of challenge: how to extend that growth across a broader population, how to create enough opportunities, not just for the highly skilled, but for the millions entering the workforce each year. At the same time, China's model is evolving. Rising wages, shifting demographics, and global pressures are pushing it up the value chain, from basic manufacturing toward more advanced production. Technology, automation, precision industries, a move from scale alone toward sophistication. India, meanwhile, is attempting to expand its industrial base, encouraging manufacturing, building infrastructure, positioning itself as an alternative destination for global production. But doing so requires building the same layered systems that took China decades to develop, and that process cannot be compressed easily. So what emerges is not a simple replacement, but a coexistence. China remains dominant in complex, large-scale manufacturing. India expands in services, while gradually increasing its industrial capacity. Two engines running in parallel, each with strengths, each with constraints, and each shaped by the structure beneath it. Manufacturing anchors growth in physical systems. Services extend growth through digital ones. One absorbs broadly, but is constrained by cost and scale. The other scales rapidly, but concentrates opportunity. And over time, these differences begin to matter more, not just for growth rates, but for resilience, for inclusivity, for how each economy adapts to change, because the next phase of the global economy may not be defined by a single dominant model, but by how these models interact, compete, and evolve. For a long time, the global system felt concentrated. Production flowed into one place, finished goods flowed outward. The structure was efficient, predictable, and deeply integrated. At the center of that system was China. Factories connected to ports, ports connected to shipping lanes, supply chains organized around a single, highly optimized hub. And for years, that concentration worked. Costs were low, scale was unmatched, coordination improved continuously. But systems built for efficiency often carry a hidden risk: dependence. And when that dependence becomes visible, through disruption, through geopolitical tension, through sudden breaks in the flow, the response is not immediate withdrawal. It is adjustment, gradual, deliberate. And that adjustment is what is now reshaping global supply chains. The idea is often described simply: diversify, reduce reliance on a single source, build resilience. But what that looks like in practice is more complex. It is not a mass relocation, not a sudden shift from one country to another. Instead, it is a layering, a spreading out. Production that once existed in a single location begins to distribute across multiple regions. A portion moves to Southeast Asia. Countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand begin to absorb segments of manufacturing. Not all at once, not across all industries, but selectively. Textiles, electronics assembly, intermediate goods, areas where cost, capacity, and logistics align. At the same time, another shift emerges. Production begins to move closer to end markets, not entirely, but partially. In North America, that movement points toward Mexico, a location that offers proximity, reduced shipping time, lower exposure to global disruptions. And this movement, often described as nearshoring, changes the geography of production. Goods do not need to travel as far. Supply chains shorten, but they also multiply, because the original system does not disappear. It evolves. China remains central. Its infrastructure, its scale, its supplier networks, these are not easily replicated. For many industries, it continues to serve as the core. High-value manufacturing, complex production, critical components. The foundation remains intact. What changes is the structure around it. Instead of a single dominant hub, the system becomes a network of interconnected nodes. Production in one country feeds into assembly in another. Components move across borders before becoming finished goods. Supply chains stretch across multiple regions, each contributing a part of the process. And that creates a different kind of system. Less concentrated, more resilient, but also more complex. More difficult to coordinate, more sensitive to disruption at multiple points rather than just one. Efficiency, in some cases, declines. Costs increase slightly. Redundancy is built in, intentionally, because the goal is no longer just optimization, it is stability. And within this shifting structure, the roles of India and China become clearer. China remains the anchor, the place where depth, scale, and capability still converge. India positions itself as part of the expansion, not replacing China, but complementing the system, absorbing certain types of production, expanding in services that support global operations, integrating into a network rather than becoming the center of it. And that distinction matters because it changes the nature of the competition. This is not a handoff, not a passing of dominance from one country to another. It is a reconfiguration. A system that once depended on concentration, now moving toward distribution. And in that distributed system, multiple countries play roles. Some grow quickly, some stabilize, some adapt. But none fully replace what came before. And that is why the shift feels incomplete, because it is ongoing, unfinished, and likely to remain that way for years to come. Supply chains are not moving in a straight line. They are branching, expanding outward, becoming something new. And within that transformation, the future of global production becomes less certain, but more flexible. The question seems inevitable. Which one wins? Which economy becomes dominant? Which model defines the future? It is a natural way to think about competition, a race, a finish line. But the system that is unfolding does not move in a straight line. It branches, it overlaps, and it resists simple outcomes. Because what is emerging between China and India is not a replacement. It is a divergence. China enters the next phase with something few economies ever achieve: depth. An industrial system that has been built over decades, refined through scale, and integrated into global production at nearly every level. Even as growth slows, that foundation remains. Factories do not disappear overnight. Supply chains do not dissolve easily. Capabilities once established tend to persist, and that persistence matters, because it anchors China within the global system, not as a temporary leader, but as a structural one, even as the economy evolves, moving toward higher value production, technology, and advanced manufacturing. The base remains intact, and that base provides stability. But stability is not the same as expansion. The demographic shift continues. The workforce changes. Growth becomes harder to sustain at previous rates. And the question becomes not whether China remains important, but how it adapts to a different kind of growth. India, meanwhile, approaches the same period from a different position, not with the same depth, not with the same level of industrial integration, but with something else: momentum, a population that is still expanding, a workforce that is still growing, a system that is still forming. The potential for acceleration exists, but it is not guaranteed, because growth at that scale requires more than demographics. It requires coordination, infrastructure that supports movement and production, education systems that prepare a workforce for evolving demands, institutions that can manage complexity as the economy expands. And these systems are still developing. Progress is visible, but uneven, and that unevenness introduces uncertainty. India's path forward is not constrained by aging, but it is constrained by execution. China's path is not constrained by capacity, but it is constrained by structure. Two different limitations, operating at the same time, and within that dynamic, the idea of a single winner becomes less clear. Because dominance, in this context, is not one-dimensional. It does not belong solely to the largest economy, or the fastest-growing one. It exists across different layers. China may continue to dominate in industrial capacity, in manufacturing depth, in the systems that produce the physical backbone of the global economy. India may expand its influence in services, in digital systems, in areas where flexibility and scale can grow without the same physical constraints. And these forms of dominance do not cancel each other out. They coexist, they interact, they compete in certain areas. They reinforce each other in others. The global system, rather than shifting from one center to another, becomes more distributed, more balanced across different types of strength. And that changes the nature of competition itself. It is no longer about replacing one model with another. It is about how these models intersect, how they adapt to shared pressures, technology, geopolitics, climate, shifting trade patterns, how they respond to internal constraints, and how they position themselves within a system that is becoming more complex, not less. Over the next 30 years, there will be moments that look decisive, periods where one appears to accelerate faster, moments where the other seems to slow. Narratives will form around those moments, predictions will be made. But beneath those cycles, the deeper structure will continue to evolve, slowly, incrementally, in ways that do not always align with short-term expectations. And that is what makes this question difficult, because it asks for a conclusion in a system that is still unfolding, still adjusting, still defining itself. The future, in this case, may not belong to one or the other, but to the interaction between them. A world where manufacturing and services, scale and flexibility, aging and expansion all exist simultaneously, where no single model dominates completely, but each shapes the outcome in different ways. And perhaps the more important question is not which one wins, but how the system changes as a result of both. Because that change will extend beyond two countries. It will shape supply chains, labor markets, investment flows, global influence, and the structure of the economy itself. Not through a single shift, but through the accumulation of many, over time, quietly, inevitably.